All right. Perfect. So just as I was saying, if you do have questions, go ahead and go into the Q&A panel. It looks like many of you already heard that because you're entering it in there. So we have had a few audio issues in the past few weeks. So if they do happen throughout this session, just give me a holler there and we'll try to remedy in the session. So those are the main basic things that we're going to have. So let's go ahead and get started with today's session. So what we're going to cover today is some of the upcoming trainings that we have here in the live training area. We're going to give you some workflow background, and we're going to build out a few samples and how they might pertain to the certification exam, and then finally finish off on some support issues. So many of you may have come to the live training here today, but if you haven't checked out a lot of other things, I would recommend that many of you go visit community.alteryx.com and really explore a lot of the different facets that we have. So for the core certification exam, a lot of our interactive lesson content is really going to help people prepare for that exam. And on top of that, much of our weekly challenge exercises are going to help as well. So anytime that you need to take your learning to the next level, I always say beyond just hearing me talk about workflows, it's good to go ahead and try them yourselves and build them and see kind of the things that you run into, and just a journey of self-discovery as you go through building your workflows. And a lot of our weekly challenges do provide that. So if I were to go into my Academy view, which is where many of you entered to this meeting today, I could go over to these weekly challenges, and that first post there will actually be an index saying what's beginner, what's intermediate, what's advanced, kind of a broad topic area that the challenge addresses. So if you want to work on something like spatial, for example, and you really just want to see a benign problem that people have solved, you can go in there and discover how people have solved them, or just try it yourself. So that's enough of my pitch for weekly challenge, but if you do want to participate in today's training, today is going to be a little bit more, I'll say, it's going to be structured, but it'll start to progress a little bit more unstructured towards the end as we start to pick up some of the loose ends, because part 4 of our core certification prep is really going to address the test day, right? What to expect on test day. So really today is just going to cover off on some basic technical elements, anything that we missed in the first 2 parts of that series, which are available on playback on Academy. But if you do want to follow along, I do have 2 downloads here on Academy. So check that out. Beyond that, we do have a training next week, Introduction to Alteryx for Excel users. So if anyone on your team comes from an Excel background and are looking to get started, go ahead and recommend this training to them. They might find it useful to use their Excel knowledge to contextualize what they're doing inside of Alteryx. Then finally, at the end of the month here, we're going to wrap up this core certification series with part 4. And again, that's going to address what to expect on test day, how to get your final preparation items in order, what that test experience looks like, some strategy items about how to attack the exam, and some best practices along the way. And coming up soon here, we're going to try to get that December schedule published for live training. So if you're always looking for more, we're going to post those up here pretty soon. So I'm just going to pause here and do a quick knowledge check. And what I'm showing here are tools that are addressed in the core certification exam. If you have not seen this view before, you could go to our certification page, and there's a certification prep guide there. My recommendation would be to go and download that and check this out. And I provide essentially a view that's a self-assessment of where you stand with each of these tools, right? So for each tool, I've got some sort of difficulty assigned to it, and then you can check off if you feel like you're at a novice level, competent, or proficient, right? Novice would typically mean anytime you have a question about it asked of you, you probably have to go look at it inside of the designer to really see. Competent, I would say, is uses it with, sight unseen, doesn't have to look it up every time. Every once in a while, you might have to peek back into the help documentation. And proficient is, I haven't looked at help documentation for that tool in, a long time. I'm really self-sufficient in that, right? So really rate yourself on that scale, and this will kind of identify where your knowledge gaps are. But what I've done here is addressed in these green boxes is saying things that, if you've followed this series all the way through, things that you've seen in use, okay? So really we're about halfway, but one of the things that we spent more time doing in that first half is addressing fundamentals that you need to know before you even know how to use these tools. So there's a lot addressing that. And what we hope to cover by the end of today is an addition of this suite. So we're going to cover Summarize a little bit more because we kind of glossed over that. And I just want to give people a little bit of a deeper understanding. We're going to cover all of these orange tools, anything that's in the Analyze tab, some documentation, some prep, but you'll see that there's a few left out here. I'll try to address those as I see fit if we can get them in today, but I purposely attacked this set because if you'll notice the tool difficulty on these are much higher. So I really want to enable people, whereas sort is 1 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 5 out of 10. So the most difficult one is around a 5 out of 10. And I know we have some interactive lessons around those. So I really wanted to make sure that we knocked out a lot of the hardest ones today. And I might try to squeeze in some sort and unique so we could actually only have a few tools left that we should look into beyond today. So that's what we hope to cover by the end of the session. A lot of it will be around these transpose and cross tab because those are very difficult tools to understand, but once you kind of set your mind into a certain paradigm, it becomes much easier to work with. And in fact, once you know how to use them, they'll actually make your workflows a little bit more dynamic. So let's first go to our Summarize tool. And this is essentially a tool that we use anytime we want to do some sort of calculation vertically across my data set, right? Many people might think that I might be adding column 1 to column 2 to column 3. That's not the case. With the Summarize tool, I'm adding vertically, so I could simply do a sum of sales, right? But with the Summarize tool, we address something called granularity. So what is granularity? That means how high level or how low level do I want my information? So at this particular view of my data set, we could say that I have a really low granularity. I can see information about a store, the customers that are going there, and the number of sales that they have, right? And it looks like what we're going to call a transaction granularity because I can see that Bob Dude, for example, has gone to store B multiple times. So I can say this actually represents each time you went to the checkout. So a really low granularity, right? And sometimes for our analysis, we don't want to see something that small. We want to see just, for store A, what was my sales? I'm not interested in seeing a transaction by transaction basis. I want to kind of roll that up within a hierarchy. So that's why we go that way and talk about that granularity. So in order to understand how we set that granularity, we use this group by statement. And this group by essentially says, how do I want to group my data together if I don't want it all into separate pieces, right? So in this case, let's say I want to see a count of customers by store, right? In this case, I can see store A has 2 customers, store B has, well, in this case, a count of 3 customers, but it could be 2 if I do distinct, right? Store C will have 1, and D will have 1, right? So really what I'd expect as a result of this data set is really 4 rows, right? 1 that represents each store since I'm grouping it together. 1 for store A, 1 for store B, so on and so forth, and then setting some sort of count paradigm in, okay? So what I'm going to be doing with my Summarize tool is saying, hey, to set that new granularity, go ahead and group by store and count the customers. And here you can actually see, based on how we analyze our data, I'm just doing a raw count because my store B has 3 customers, but really it has 2, and there's also an additional function that we have where you can do a distinct count, saying, hey, if I have somebody with the same name, only count them once. But in this case, it looks like a raw count. More than anything else, you could think of this as the number of times customers visited the store. So it might be better to call this visits. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I think I saw something come through. It looks like someone is having difficulty hearing me on the chat, so I'm going to pause there and make sure that people can hear me okay. Okay, sounds good. And do remember, I do have some people coming into the chat. I am trying to monitor the Q&A because I can actually see hands raised throughout the presentation. So you'll get my attention just a little bit faster if you go ahead and enter it there. So thank you, everybody. It looks like we're hearing fine, so we'll continue. So let's actually say I just want to do a sum of sales. Really, you can see I'm changing my group by, right? Now I'm asking a different question, and I'm changing the granularity. Instead of looking at my information on a store level, I want to look for my information on a customer-by-customer basis. So, hey, for each customer, what was their number of sales? So you can see actually Bob Dude, he appears 4 times throughout this data set, and I want to aggregate all those transactions into just one Bob Dude record. I want all of his sales compiled into one row, right? And that's where I sum his sales together. So you can see Dan Duran, Billy Bonk, Optimus Prime, Bob Dude. Really, I have 4 different customers purchasing from my stores. So as a result, by grouping by this customer, I'd expect only 4 records. And for each of those 4 records, I'd expect them to be combined in a way that would be a sum of their sales. So that's really what Summarize is doing. Now, you could group by multiple things, right? I could group by year and by month if I wanted just to get kind of a monthly data aggregation. So that'd be an example of something where I could actually set a number of them. But by default, I think a lot of people run it with 1. Now, one important thing to call out is that 1, the Summarize tool will never make your data grow, right? In fact, it will make it shrink, if anything, if you're actually aggregating your data up. So in this case, you can see I went from 8 records down to 4 in each of these scenarios. And then in addition to that, as a rule of thumb, I don't have the same number of columns either, right? So I literally get the number of columns as I do actions that I've assigned to the Summarize tool. So if I didn't even group by anything and just said, give me a sum of sales, what would I get? Well, I actually said, I don't want to group by anything. I just want to combine it all into one record, sum of sales, right? So I'm going to get literally a 1-row, 1-column result that's going to give me the total sales. So it does shrink down that data set, but that's something to be aware of is whatever I select as my actions is what's going to be reflected inside of my data set. I won't be carrying on any, we'll call them extracurricular fields, right? Because that granularity has changed. It might be a misgiving to say that this data is a transaction level, but also has, month level sales. It might get confusing for your data set. So it's best practice just to kind of regenerate it. So Summarize for each, okay? When I talked about generating those actions, right, this is really what that interface inside the Summarize tool looks like. So here you can see that I have a list of all my fields. I can see what type they are. And the type is important because that's going to dictate what kind of action I can take against them, right? For a string, for example, I might be able to concatenate all of the word values together into one. If it was a double or something numeric, I could do a sum of them. So depending on the type will actually allow you to do different types of actions. And how I'd create an action on each of these fields, let's say I was going to group by customer segment, I would go to customer segment and select that, so it would be highlighted blue as transaction is here. Select add, and you'd see that action group by be in a selection dialog that would pop up, and we're going to visit that. And the same thing with sales. In this case, you'll see it's double, so I can finally do that sum. If you see some that is not available, you might have to look back and see if your type is available. And finally, you can rename that output field. So if you don't like how it names it by default, you can just rewrite the new name into this final piece. But really down here is the fields that you're going to get out of your data set, out of the Summarize, which is going to be 2 fields, one for customer segment and one for sum of sales. Okay. Now, brace yourselves. All right, so we're about to jump into the world of pivoting. And if you're coming from an Excel background, I want you to throw out everything you know. Don't come into this exercise and try to compare it with Excel because it's going to behave very differently. So if you're trying to contextualize it in that experience, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I just like to say, just clear the mind, start from ground zero, and just observe it for what it is, okay? So inside of the Alteryx Designer, when we talk about pivoting our data, there's really two tools that we use, okay? And they're called crosstab and transpose. And I'm going to show you this icon up here because this is a really important indicator of what the actions are for that tool. So in this case, you can see I have a column that's being turned into a row. Okay? So what does that really look like? So let's look at a data set that I have here. And this is something that we're actually going to work directly with because this is not an uncommon format to receive your data in. So this is actually a query from an API, and a lot of them just list off a whole bunch of values, right? So I have the city of San Francisco repeating many times, but I can see that it's got a field called name saying, hey, what was the description of the weather? It was sunny. The temperature, it was 72. The wind was 9 miles per hour, and the humidity was 10%. So a helpful data set, but I know a lot of people, the way they might want to view it is say, hey, I want to keep this column that says the city of San Francisco, but I want this column to turn to a kind of the headers, right? I want a description, a temperature, a wind, a humidity, and I want all these values underneath these headers, okay? So there's three things that I'm going to do, and there's three options within that crosstab tool. One is called group by, the other is name and value, right? And the name and value are really easy to identify because it's saying, hey, what column do I want to become my new headers, my new record headers, column names, right? Description, temperature, wind, humidity. And which field do I want to become my values? So if these were to become my headers, I want these to be the values that are underneath them. However, the city of San Francisco, I kind of like the format it's in. I just don't want to pivot it. I just want it to reflect the new values, right? And that's where we group by the city. And I'm saying group by city is a great way of saying, hey, don't partake in this pivot. You stay where you are. And what it's going to do is take these four records that all relate to San Francisco and turn them all into just one record. And that's really why that group by verbiage comes around, is because as we pivot all these to the headers and all these to the values underneath it, it's really going to be one value for San Francisco. So it's going to group all of that kind of blown out information around San Francisco together. Now, it's good for me to talk about it, but let's actually see it in action, right? So the first thing I chose was the group by San Francisco. Done. That value is kind of pulled together. And all that's left is to take my two fields, name and value. I'm going to assign this field, name, to be my new field name column, and then these to be my values. So what it's going to do is actually flip those columns into rows as foretold by this tool icon, and this would be my resulting data set. It's much cleaner, much easier to work with. And this can be really important because if I had Dallas and Chicago, right, and all of them had 4 records apiece, as long as I grouped by city, I would have actually come down to 3 records, 1 for each city. So really interesting use case. How does that actually look? Here's a quick view so you can see that I have these grouping values inside the crosstab tool. In this case, when I went back here, I grouped by city. So I would have selected city here. I chose the header field to be name and the value field to be value, and we're done. Okay. Now I will show you some methodologies. That gets to be a little bit more advanced, but I will show you how those work once we get into the designer itself. And there are some actions that you can do as you pivot your data around. Now, we talked about moving columns to rows, but there's another tool that does rows to columns, and that's called the transpose tool. So we have a tool here. You can see I'm taking the rows and turning it into columns. We call that transpose. I remember when I first started learning these pivot tools, I always went back to the icon to really understand what I'm doing. Now, this is where it's important, where I say, definitely keep your mind clear of anything in Excel, right? This is just how pivots work inside of Alteryx. So we all probably have data like this where we have a store information and we have a column for quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. It could go on for infinity. It could be month level, week level, right? But the problem is that if I were to use a formula tool, I'd really have to specify literally each of these quarters. And as new quarters kind of appear in my data set as it gets updated, that formula tool would have to also be updated. So a lot of people, what they do is they transpose this data into a column so they can use that summarize tool we talked about earlier. You can just run a sum across one column, right, instead of actually, adding multiple columns together manually. So think of this as the inverse of what we did with our crosstab tool. And we're actually going to say, hey, take these values and turn them into columns, right? So what I really want, instead of saying Geppetto's Puppets, one record, and then with 3 different columns, I actually want 3 rows of Geppetto's Puppets, one for quarter 1, one for quarter 2, one for quarter 3, and the corresponding sales values within there. Okay? So instead of grouping, we actually have something called key, right? And the key is actually, I like to say, it's almost like a degrouping, for lack of a better word, right? Now that Geppetto's Puppets has 3 quarters, I want 3 records, one for each quarter. So I'm going to say for store, make that a key field, and then for anything else in the data set, just transpose it, okay? And it's going to create 2 columns. So first I'm going to select that key store, okay? I'm going to bring those quarters down. That transpose is going to take place. And since it's a key field, that Geppetto's Puppets will be sure to accommodate all of them. Now, a lot happened there, but I will say no matter how you transpose, no matter how you configure it, you'll have the number of columns over here that represent keys. So if you selected 5 key values, you would have 5 columns. Okay? Now, for the rest of the things that actually partook in the pivot in this case, they will only and always be transposed into 2 columns, name and value. Okay? They will always be name, and they will always be name, value. It always goes to 2 fields. Okay? And that's really important to know because the name really says, hey, this is what used to be your headers, what used to be your names, and this is really what used to be the values underneath those. So that's really important to know. And as you start to play with those, you might feel like it's a lot of trial and error at first, but as soon as you start getting into a cadence, it becomes a lot easier to work with. So let's get in and actually try this hands-on and see this in action. So I'm going to go ahead, let me just navigate to some data here. And I'm going to go with, let's start with crosstab here. And many of you might have this already open by default with a solution, and that's absolutely fine. You can just watch what I'm doing here. So let me navigate to my data here. Got too many windows open here. All right. London weather.yxdb. Okay. So this is the exact same problem that we just talked about that I had, except it's a lot more blown out. It's a lot deeper. We're seeing a lot more around this data. So let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to accomplish this, right? All this data refers to London, I should be saying, which is great, but gosh, how many records is this, right? It's 30 records. That's going to take a lot of room. I just want all of these values on the left to really be my columns, and these values here to the right to be the data underneath that. So really, when I think about it, I'm asking myself, hey, what I really want to do is I want to turn this data set so the name becomes the headers, and this becomes the row below it. So it sounds a lot like columns to rows. So if I were to go over here, I'm going to say columns to rows. That's a crosstab problem, right? That's how I'm going to solve it. So that's going to be our London data. Now, I'm just going to do something really quick because the one thing that I am missing from this data set, I can see I have the name London in here. That's great. I'm just missing value, right? I'm missing some sort of method of saying what country it's from. Actually, let's just skip that for now. Let's just get right to the crosstab and have some fun. So I'm going to bring a crosstab in here. And in this case, I really don't have a key field, right? Hopefully, if I was just had multiple blown out cities, I would have London, 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 London all down here, and then Dallas, 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 so on and so forth. But right now, this data set represents one city, so I'm not concerned. So I'm going to go to my column headers and say, what do I want to be my column header? As we said, the name field is exactly what we wanted, and the value string was underneath it. And I'm just going to deselect this method for now, just to show you what's going to happen. Error, right? Something must be specified during the crosstab method. So what does this method do? I'm going to run a concat by default and show you exactly what's happening, okay? And this is really important whenever you're doing your consideration. So I've got all these field names nicely tucked in here, except there's some things that I really wouldn't expect, like ID, right? That's a really weird ID, 500, 301, 5091, too large number, right? Let's go back and look at our data and see what was happening. Well, down here I can see I have an ID here, 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 right? So I have a lot of IDs. That didn't really transpose nicely. What happened was I said anything that had the name ID, right? What do I want to do in the case where there might be some sort of aggregation needed since there was multiple IDs, right? In this case, I said concatenate. So since there were 4 different ID values, it concatenated them all together underneath one header, okay? Now, this plays super nice if you had one distinct header value and you didn't have to worry about them being duplicates. So that's one way around it. And you'd always have to select an aggregate value even if they were distinct, which is kind of a default behavior. But you could also do something as simple as say, hey, if there are duplicates, you know, just select the first one. I don't want to see all of the remaining values in there. So you can see in this case, it selected the first value that it came across in that duplication and just pushed everything out. Okay. Now, another thing that's really important is if I transpose, there are actually different types of aggregating values. So I can do stuff for numeric values that I couldn't do with strings. So since I was working with string data there, that worked really well. Let's just say I'm going to mock up a quick data set. We'll call this one name. We'll say value. And I have the values 1, 2, 3. Okay. And I'm going to transpose, crosstab, sorry, excuse me. See, I'm even confusing myself here. Crosstab my data here. I'm going to say name and value. Okay. Now, if you look down here, as soon as I selected value, it says, hey, I see something different. I see this is numeric. What's up with that, right? If I'm transposing it, how do I want them to react to each other, right? Since I'm looking at this data set, I can expect everything to go into one column, column A. So how do I want to account for that? Maybe it's just a sum, right? So 3 plus 2 plus 1 is going to be 6. It could be a count of those values. It could be a percent. Some people don't know this, but we actually have total rows and total columns as well. So this isn't as helpful in this case, but it actually says a total of all the rows in this data set. So there are a lot of actions down there, and we do quiz on that on the exam, so give that a close look. Okay? So that is some of the cross-tabbing that goes on. Now let's jump over to transpose. So transpose is just a little bit of a one-off from what we discussed during our PowerPoint example, but it also should be similar enough that it's familiar. So let me just get back to my transpose data here and bring in our pet store monthly sales data. And here it is, that common perpetrator. I'm just going to add a browse here. You can see I have data for January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, right, all the way down to a total row. And if I wanted to do that, let's say I wanted to recreate that total, I'll just start building a total column. And don't follow me. I'm just saying why you might go to a transpose, right? I would add January plus February plus March plus April, right? And this is assuming that my data set doesn't change. If I were to have, at the end of this data set, you can see it goes through December. If it rolled in the new year for January 2019, I'd have to go back and update this. But really, I haven't, this is an incomplete formula, but this is just showing that process of what I'd have to do to get to that total, right? What some other people might do is they actually might come down to this transpose option and go to a transpose, okay? So first thing we have to do is decide what don't we want to partake in our transpose, right? And for me, that's anything that addresses the information of my store. I just want the month in their data to transpose. And you'll see here, I've got November through December available. And total, I'm just not going to include at all. I don't want it in my resulting data set. Okay. Now, quiz question for everybody. Ask yourself this. If I transposed these 12 fields, how many would I get out? Not including the keys, right? Remember I said it only goes to 2 columns. Name, aka all the names from this header row, and values, anything underneath that. And that might be a little abstract, so let's just build it out here and say I want to keep anything that's not the month value. I want to make sure I'm transposing all the months, and I said I would forget that total value. Okay, let's take a peek at that data. Now you can see that I have all of the information around all creatures great and small. I've got all of their data for each month. Okay, and if we wanted to loop that in back to the view and say, hey, how much did all creatures great and small make for the month or for the year? We can bring in that summarize tool and say, hey, for each name, remember our granularity, for each store, what was the sum of my values? So you see how that was a lot quicker. And no matter how many columns I had, right, they'd all transpose into that name and value set. So it's really dynamic. So as my data set changes, as long as it's a part of that transpose, it will forever be a part of that summation. So I've got a really nice square-looking data set of my sum of values. So I'm just going to pause there and just see if there are any questions around transposing data. So it's important to know transposing and cross-tabbing, especially if you're in your first time, it's something that a lot of people have to try multiple times to get into the shape they want. I'm at the point where I know exactly what's going to happen as I get it out because I've worked with it enough and I'm comfortable with it. Now, the important thing to know, right, is during this certification exam, you will actually get a question that says something along the lines of, here's a beginning data set, right? We'll just give you a picture of this, and we'll give you a picture of this, right? And then we'll give you pictures of a few different workflows, and you have to say which ones would really produce those results. So even though I mentioned the knowledge base of what you need to know for each tool at the front, it's also important to know where they interact. You need to be able to say to yourself, okay, if this is the data set as it appears, I can know from a transpose that it's probably down to just name and value, and they're summarizing those values and doing a group by. That workflow works. The picture of this workflow would work, okay? And those are probably the most challenging questions that you'll come across on the exam because for many of the other questions, you can come into the designer and tweak it around and play with it and prove out to make sure that question does what you expect. But when we provide 2 different data sets and applied questions, as we call them, it just takes too much time to build out all those workflows to those scenarios. So really getting the idea of just how these behave, right? How they actually shape, how they shape and change the data are going to be really important. And we're actually getting some comments in there. 100% agreed. Those are the only ones that trip me up. And yeah, it's just definitely one of those things you have to think outside the box. And the one thing that I'll actually say too, that some people might be here for, is saying those questions trip me up. What those questions are intended to do is to show you there's not one right answer. Many of them are multiple selection. So there are multiple right ways to the solution, which is always a mantra we've had as Alteryx, right? There are certainly some answers that may be less optimal by your point of view, but don't let that interfere with the correctness of that workflow, if that makes any sense. So I showed you an example of using a formula tool to achieve a total. That works for the given question, right? Even though this one might be a little sexier, a little nicer, a little bit more dynamic, right? Whatever gets the right answer, take it at face value, right? Don't overthink it. So that's definitely one of my things that I emphasize to people along the way. So let's just dig into, I know I promised a little bit more around that summarize tool. So what I really like doing for the summarize tool is just opening the one tool samples for it. And if you didn't see me, I did that really quickly, clicking on the summarize tool and clicking open example. Okay, and here I'm going to run this workflow, and you'll see I have this data set that's just names of people, city, state, customer segment, how many times it is the store, how much is spent there, dates, so on and so forth. And you can see for each of these, they kind of fit into the paradigm that I spoke about earlier, right? So in this case, I have selected the field spend. It said, hey, what's the total spend across all of my stores, no matter what time of day they were spent at? And you can see, what did I say? One action. I get one column as an output, right? I don't get all of those extra columns about first name, last name, city, state. I've simply said my aggregation should just be one total, the sum of spending. Now, we've talked about just some summing, but I don't want that to hinder people from the fact that we have a lot of actions right here. So up here at the top, I have kind of our top 10. But if you really wanted to get more aggressive with what you're doing, you can see a lot of finance type of aggregation, some numeric ones that people might have, median and mode, standard deviation, variance, right? If I was getting into string, you can see I'm not working with the string value, so they're grayed out, but you can actually see some string options here. Also, if you're doing any spatial, and you can actually do that here. A lot of people don't remember that, but you can work spatially through the summarize tool as well. So you can see here I'm doing a min and max. So I have two actions, two columns, right? One action count, one column. So you can see exactly what's going on here. Here's a group by, right? So they're literally saying group by city, which is giving me a distinct list of cities. Here's a good call out for this tool. It is case sensitive, right? So if I am grouping by, you can see that I have the city of Arvada and Arvada, right? It doesn't see them as the same because they're titled case differently. So here's going to be my first option to introduce a tool that kind of fell through the gaps, but we want to make sure that gets out along the way, is a data cleansing tool. And this tool is really easy to understand. In fact, it was built to be even easier than the formula tool because that's the way it used to be. So I'm just going to say, what field do I want to cleanse? I'm going to say city. I didn't see it in this case, but there could have been leading and trailing white space, so I'll make sure that I remove any unwanted characters there. This is fine. I don't think I need any replacing nulls. And I actually want to modify the case of all of my cities, right? I want to make sure they're all uppercase, so I'm not getting that duplication once I get to the group by, right? So it's going to take all those cities and put them all to uppercase. So if I were to run that and then go back to my results, you can see now I have one Arvada, right? So go ahead and play around with that tool. It's very easy and intuitive to understand. It's literally saying for whatever field I select here, perform this set of actions, okay? Now, another way around the solution, and this is actually another way somebody may have solved for this problem, is for this group by, and let me rerun it so it's kind of duplicated out these values again. Let's just say it is what it is. I don't want to go through and do the data cleansing. I just want to manually pick out the values that I want out of this data set. And that actually circles back to the select records tool, which is probably not used enough by a lot of people, right? So this tool literally says, select which records I want out of this data set. For me, these two look like the odd ones out. They're title cased, and 1 through 2 looks good, 5 through 12 looks good. Okay, so let's go ahead and use this tool to do that. You can see up here there's some examples. I'm going to say give me ranges 1 through 2, 5 through 12, and see that they are separated by a return or a new line. And what I've done here is just simply skipped over those records. Okay. Now, there are multiple ways I could have written this. I am literally specifying the ranges of record 1 through record 2. I could have deleted this and said anything before record 2, and a plus sign to say anything after record 5. And that plus sign might be helpful because you actually might not know. You might have millions of records after 5 and don't want to find explicitly what you need to state. So that's another way of specifying it around the way. So that's probably something that you're going to see in those workflow type of questions as well. So that's the Select Records tool. Very easy once you get used to it. But I recommend checking out the help to make sure that you've got all those formats down. And I'll just show you one more. Let's say I wanted to grab the city of Denver. I'm just going to say, give me row 5, right? And this is a great way. Anytime I do any inspection on data and I just want to see one record at a time or two, like let's compare records 5 and 6 against each other, right? It's a nice way of isolating what you need. So that's the Select Record tool. Now, the other things that I did promise along the way is comments and containers. So a little bit about documentation, right? And these tools you can actually find in the documentation interface, comment and tool container, and they're very commonly used. And the reason that they're commonly used is these containers, in this case, are really powerful. And you can see that I have an ability to enable and disable workflows in containers. So if I were to run this workflow right now, it's not doing anything to my workflow. Okay, let's say I brought 2 tools outside of it and disabled. I could run this workflow. It runs up until these 2 tools, but no further, right? I've actually disabled the ability for that workflow to run data further down the line. And all I would do to do that is I could bring in a container, drag it onto my canvas, and just select what I want to be as a part of my container. Now, that's not the only way you have to use it. Some people use it as a nice way of grouping data together, right? They can actually go in here and title these. So in this case, I could say, I want to name this country. I could add a caption, country, right? And it's a nice way of kind of annotating my workflow, or even better, moving my workflow in chunks around and rearranging them. So some other things that might be a helpful tip along the way, delete the container only, is that there are some interface options to be aware of. So we also do test on just the whole environment, right, inside of the designer. So one thing as simple as, how do I line these 2 tools up vertically, right? That we actually have hotkeys. And this, for many of these questions, we refer to our help documentation. So the answers are somewhere. But I'll give you a clue, because I think this is one that's on the exam, is how do I align these vertically? And if you press Control-Shift+, they're aligned vertically. Remember, that's Control-Shift+. And actually, I'll do this another way around. Let's say I actually wanted to align this set of tools a little bit better, right? I can say Control-Shift-, and they all align nicely. And also, if I right-clicked on these, I could actually say distribute nicely, so they're all kind of evenly spaced. So I'll do that again, right-click. You can see I have those align horizontally and vertically options, but I also have distribute, meaning like space them evenly between each other. And that's really helpful even beyond the exam. I know for a lot of people, they're really perfectionists in terms of alignment for their tools. So that's another bonus along the way. The one thing that I will call out as well is the comment tools, and you might not know it, but you see them all the time. Here's a comment tool, here's a comment tool, here's a comment, so on and so forth, right? Let's just bring in a comment and see what that looks like. You can see I have one right here. I could go in here and write some text. This is my comment. I could bring in a tool. And the one thing that by default a lot of people see is that the order of how these are dragged into the canvas matters. So if I drag in a comment after this tool, aka it's a newer tool, so to speak, it's going to overlap my old one. So if I right-click on that, I can send it backward to say send it behind this particular tool. And then it's nicely kind of outlining this tool. And I could resize that. And it's important to know that that's beyond that, I can change kind of the shape of that rectangle, if I want a border or not, the font that's there, the text color, the background color, and even, many people don't know this, and it does get tested, a background image, right? You can actually put your logo in there, for example, if you want to add some sort of picture. But the way you see a lot of people use this is a way of just containing logical parts of their workflow. So if they want to see a particular grouping, right, and say, hey, this section of the workflow does this. And I've even seen organizations that color code. Let me cancel out of here. They say, hey, this part of the workflow, anything that's pink by our rules, Oh man, that's bright. Anything that's pink, right, represents some sort of prepping or this business rule. So we see that a lot in use in terms of being able to work with documentation in a team environment. So a lot of information coming in fast. Let's get back to the presentation and see, now that I've gotten a lot of the basics out here, if there's any more knowledge gaps that we can cover. So we've covered comment, tool container, summarize, data cleansing, select records. It did meet everything I promised, except for this count records. And surprise, this count records, I hardly need to train. If I brought my count records in, it does exactly what it says. It counts the number of records coming from the data set before it. It just is a tool that does get tested. So if I were to run this workflow, I could see, well, I have one record in this case, and it's going to show me one record. But this tool will always result in one column and one row only, and that's just the pure count of the number of rows in that data set. So that does get tested as well. So with that all being said, I'm going to say a few final pieces because I got through the content I need to today. And then if anybody has any questions around these tools or anything else that were in those gap tools, let's chat about it. So let me just finish on these few items here and just say, if you were enough and based on what you saw today, you are confident, go to our community and sign up for that certification. If you do sign up today, you will be lined up to be a part of our December cohort. So do know that there is a lead time. So if you think you want to take it in December, sign up now. Our certification exams, I always say this over and over again, they're focused more in learning than they are assessment. And that's a really important note. That is to say, when you walk into your certification exam, you will learn something. And I've heard it from our most expert users. So that being said, it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I say these exams are free. The only thing that you lose is 2 hours of your time if you don't pass, right? And along the way, you learn so much that it's really going to help you the next time. You're not guaranteed 2 same exams because we do have kind of a lottery, a bank of questions that get served up. But you will learn along the way, and the focus is growing your ability. And I also will say that we purposely named this the core exam and not the beginner exam, right? So if you went through the series, we literally gave people a taste of all the tools that are going to be covered. But our questions go into all the nuances that these tools have in every single setting. So just be really prepared to go to a tool. And I just tell people, go around and really look at these tools and just stare at them and click around and see what happens. I like to say this metaphor. So for me, one of my personal interests is mountain biking. And they say, a lot of people think the best way to become a great mountain biker is by getting a shuttle lift up a mountain and racing down as fast as you can and doing that over and over again. For a lot of people, it's sitting in a parking lot and standing in their bike and trying to balance it while it's holding still, right? It's not that adrenaline building workflows, working on your business use cases like you would be racing down a mountain. Sometimes it's just finding the limits of what your bike can do and just even the nuanced behavior. So I just recommend bringing in a tool and inspecting everything that it has to offer and what the different behaviors do and really just see, if you click this, what happens now? And that will really get you a lot further on. So beyond that, check out our Alteryx Academy because anything that we've circled outside of those gaps are addressed in our live training. So check those out. They are pretty easy tools though. The only more difficult one we have left, which tends to be not that difficult if you understand filtering, is our filter tool. So I definitely want to recommend people that way as the next tool to look at. And then finally, if you do have any issues, if it's technically related to the actual product itself, go ahead and contact us at support@alteryx.com. But if it's something around the certification exam, it is certification@alteryx.com. So that's kind of all I have for today. Now I'm open to any questions people may have about any tools that were addressed today or any that they just want to hear a little bit more about.